A child's life ends not with a plea, but with the snap of a rope. That was the law in Crimson Ridge. And today, that rope waited for Sarah. She was accused, tried, and condemned by sundown. The crowd gathered, their faces hard, hungry for justice, or maybe just for blood. The noose grazed her cheek. But then, a shadow fell across the platform. A bottle crashed. It was Silas, the town drunkard, a man who hadn't stood for anything in years. And he was standing right in the hangman's way. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The gallows stood black against a burning sky, a monument to consequence. Sarah, barely a woman, stood upon it. Her hands were bound, her face a canvas of stark, silent terror. She did not cry. She did not beg. She just watched the dust swirl at her feet, a tiny whirlwind in the oppressive heat. The hangman, a man with no name and no expression, tested the knot. The crowd swayed, a single organism breathing in the tense anticipation. They whispered of the crime, of the judge, of the swiftness of the verdict. It was right. It had to be right. The rope grazed her cheek. A final, cold caress. But then, a shadow fell across the platform. A bottle, arcing high from the back of the crowd, shattered against the base of the gallows. Green glass and cheap whiskey exploded onto the dry wood. A gasp, a collective intake of breath. The hangman froze. The sheriff, his hand on his holster, turned. It was Silas, the town drunkard. A man defined by his failures, by the gutter. A man who hadn't stood for anything in years. He stumbled forward, pushing through the stunned silence. He didn't look heroic. He looked pathetic. His shirt was stained, his eyes bloodshot, and he was standing right in the hangman's way. Sheriff Brody moved, his boots heavy on the packed earth. Each step was a decision. He was a good man, or tried to be. A morally conflicted man, caught between the town's rage and the letter of the law. The law was clear. The girl was guilty. His job was clear. He stopped a foot from Silas, the smell of whiskey washing over him. Silas, Brody's voice was low. Get out of the way. This ain't your business. The crowd murmured, the spell broken, anger returning. Move him, Sheriff, someone yelled. Silas didn't look at Brody. He looked at the girl. He looked at the rope. He was shaking, a tremor that ran from his boots to his shoulders. The crowd saw the drunk, the DTs, the weakness. Brody saw it too, but he also saw something else, something deep in the man's eyes. A fire, or the last ember of one. Silas, I won't ask again. Brody's voice was harder now, the voice of the law. He had to end this. For the town, for the girl. A quick death was better than this dramatic circus. Silas finally turned his head. His gaze met the sheriff's. His lips were cracked. He said one word, a word that hung in the air, heavier than the Sunday no. It was not a shout. It was barely a whisper. But it was minimalist, high impact. It was absolute. It was a line drawn in the dust. The contrast between innocence and violence was no longer just the crowd and the girl. It was now this broken man and the entire town. Silas kept shaking. But the tremor wasn't just the drink. It was a moral dilemma made flesh. He was remembering. Not a memory of courage, but a memory of failure. A memory of a sound that didn't match the story. A sound he had tried to drown with the very bottle he just broke. He was standing here not because he was strong, but because he was too weak to walk away. This was his internal dilemma. To stay silent and let the child die, or to speak and be called a liar, a drunk. He chose the gallows. He chose to stand. The emotional high stakes weren't just about Sarah anymore. They were about Silas, about whether a man could unwrithe himself from the gutter long enough to save a life. He had nothing left to lose, except the last, forgotten scrap of his own soul. Why was a child on the gallows? The mystery reveal was a story written in blood, just hours old. It began not with the sun, but with a scream that tore the dawn. A sound that ripped through the morning mist. Judge Thorne was dead. Not just dead, murdered. Bludgeoned in his own study. The heavy oak desk splintered. The leather-bound books scattered. Their poetic justice silenced. Judge Thorne, the man who owned the bank, the freight company, and half the land in the new territory. The man whose word was more than law. It was gravity. His death left a void. A cold, terrifying vacuum. His power had been the only thing keeping the ranchers from the farmers, the railroad from the settlers. Now, that power was gone, and into that void stepped Elias Thorne, the judge's son. A man carved from his father's shadow, but colder, sharper, like fractured ice. Elias was the one who found him, or so he claimed. He was the one who raised the alarm, his voice echoing in the pre-dawn chill, and he was the one who found her. Sarah, his servant girl, found, they said, standing over the body in the dark-to-light transition of the morning. Her apron stained crimson, the bloody fireplace poker. His poker, still gripped in her small, white-knuckled hand. She hadn't spoken, not a word, not when Elias dragged her out onto the street, his face a mask of dramatic, righteous fury for all the town to see, not when the sheriff locked her in the cell, not when Elias himself, the emotionally complex antagonist, stood before the saloon steps just an hour later and demanded justice. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a minimalist chisel, precise and deadly, chipping away at the town's raw fear. "She took my father," he'd said, his words, high impact. "She betrayed his trust. She betrayed this town. She will not see another Sunday." Elias controlled everything. The jobs, the loans, the future. He was the new gravity, and the town knew it. He didn't need to shout. His whisper could foreclose a mortgage or empty a store. The town, morally conflicted and terrified of the chaos his father's death would bring, needed a sacrifice. They needed an answer. Fast. And Elias gave them one. He gave them Sarah. She was the perfect target. An innocent child. An orphan the judge had taken in, half servant, half charity case. She had no family to speak for her. No one to question the story. An easy target. The emotional tone of the town was desperate. A desperate, tense need for the world to make sense again, to restore the order the judge had represented. And Elias, in his dark, perfectly tailored suit, provided the punctuation. A trial, it was a formality, a chronological progression of foregone conclusions. Witnesses were called. Elias, the sheriff, who confirmed the scene. The verdict was guilty before the first question was asked. The sentence was death. Immediate. That was Elias's demand. Not justice. Vengeance. Swift and total. He demanded immediate justice. And the town, gripped by his economic and emotional control, agreed. They became a single, hungry entity, eager to close the open loop of the murder with the cinematic finality of a hanging. This was the weight against which Silas now leaned. It wasn't just a crowd. It was the crushing power of Elias Thorne. A power built on his father's legacy, sealed with his father's blood, and now aimed directly at the neck of one small, silent girl. The contrast between innocence and violence was complete. The town's violent need for order, and the child who was about to pay for it. The single word "no" hung in the air, heavier than the gallows beam. It was a pebble thrown against a mountain. Yet the mountain had flinched. Sheriff Brody stared at Silas, and the pacing of the entire day fractured. The rhythmic acceleration toward climax that Elias Thorne had demanded. It snapped. Now, there was only this. A slow-burn fuse lit by a drunkard. Brody felt the eyes of the town on his back. He felt the cold, impatient stare of Elias Thorne from the hotel balcony. His job was simple. He was the law. The law said the girl was guilty. The law said she must hang. His job, his only job, was to remove the man obstructing the law. A simple push, a club to the back of the knee, or, if necessary, the cold, final logic of the gun. He was a morally conflicted protagonist, a man who believed in order, in the clear demarcation of right and wrong. But this felt wrong. It was a sickness in his gut. He looked at Silas, really looked at him. The tremor wasn't just whiskey. It was conviction. A terrible, agonizing conviction. How could a man so lost, a man who hadn't made a right decision in a decade, be the only one standing in the way? And why did it make Brody hesitate? This was his internal dilemma, playing out for the entire town to see. He saw the contrast between innocence and violence, not just with the girl, but with Silas himself. The town saw a violent drunk. Brody, in that moment, saw a flicker of something else, something innocent, something he himself had perhaps lost. The silence stretched. The sun crawled higher, baking the grounded, dusty plaza. Brody could hear the squeak of the wind vane atop the bank. He could hear a horse shifting its weight 3 streets over. This slow burn was maddening. He had to act. He was the law. He couldn't let the town see him falter. He couldn't let a drunk defy the verdict. That was the path to chaos. That was the very thing Judge Thorne's death threatened. But he also couldn't just shoot Silas in the back. He couldn't drag him away and put the rope on the girl while this question hung in the air. He needed time. Or rather, Silas needed time. Time to do what? Brody didn't know. He just knew he couldn't pull the trigger, and he couldn't tighten the noose. Not yet. He glanced up at the Sunday. It was nearing the church steeple. An idea. A compromise. A way to uphold the law. But not this second. He would give the drunk his rope. Just a little bit of it. He stepped forward, his voice low, measured, imbued with all the gravitas of his office. He wasn't speaking to the drunk. He was speaking to the town. He was speaking to Elias. He was making a new, binding contract. "Silas," he said, and the square held its breath. "You have until the Sunday. That Sunday touches the steeple." He pointed. The shadow of the cross was just beginning to creep toward the saloon. "You have 1 hour. 1 hour to prove whatever it is you think you know. 1 hour to stop this. But when that shadow touches the bell, then I must do my job." He let the words settle. The open loop was cast. "The girl will hang, Silas. By my hand. 1 hour." He holstered his pistol, a cinematic gesture of temporary peace. But his eyes were hard. The tense atmosphere, which had frozen, now began to rhythmically accelerate again, but to a new beat. A deadline. The clock was no longer the day. The clock was the Sunday. 1 hour. The Sunday. The steeple. The words echoed in Silas's skull, a hollow drumbeat against the throbbing in his temples. The crowd was a blur of hostile, wavering faces, their voices a dull, angry roar. This tense moment wasn't just about the gallows. We transition now, deep into Silas's perspective, using third-person limited narration to see what he saw, to know what he knew. The shaking in his hands, the sickness in his stomach. It wasn't just the whiskey. It was the memory. It was the sound. This delayed reveal was a secret that had been burning in his gut all morning, a truth more potent and agonizing than any liquor. He was there. Last night. Or was it this morning? The hours bled together, a cinematic blur of shadows and shame. He'd been in the alley behind the judge's house, a place he often sought, seeking shelter from the wind, a biting emotional metaphor for his own ruined life. He'd huddled behind the empty rain barrels, the bottle his only companion, his only firelight against the cold. He was drifting, sinking into that familiar, numb dark. When the voices cut through the fog, they were sharp, tense. One voice was the judge's, unmistakable. A roar of indignation, loud enough to carry. "You come here, to my house, and demand?" The other voice was not Sarah's. It was a man's. It was lower, minimalist, but laced with a cold, desperate fury that chilled Silas more than the night air. "You owe me. You can't cut me off. It's my inheritance. You will not ruin me." Silas's internal monologue-style narration replayed the scene in agonizing, sensory-rich detail. He'd pressed himself flat against the cold, damp brick, a ghost in the shadows, He just wanted to be invisible. He didn't want to be part of their violent, sober world. Then the judge's voice, final as a gavel, booming into the night. "You will get nothing. You are no son of mine. Now, get out." There was a scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. A heavy footstep. Then, the sound. A sound that wasn't a word. A shocking, wet thud. Heavy, like an axe splitting damp wood. It was followed by a choked gasp. The dramatic pause that followed was absolute. A silence so profound it felt louder than the argument. Silas held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't see the murder, but he heard it. He heard the exact moment life ended. Then, after the silence, after the thud, came the scream. It was Sarah, high-pitched, piercing, a scream of discovery, not of guilt. He knew it. He knew the difference. He had run. He scrambled out of the alley, the bottle forgotten in the dirt. He ran from the sound, from the death, from the truth. He ran straight to the saloon, pouring whiskey on the memory, trying to drown it. But the sound, the thud, it wouldn't sink. And now, standing in the hot sun, watching the noose sway over her innocent head, he knew. The voice, the other voice. He couldn't place it yet. But it wasn't hers. He knew she was innocent. He, the town pariah, was the only one. This was his moral dilemma. Stay silent, and let the child die for his cowardice. Or speak, and be called a liar. The sheriff's words. 1 hour. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a sentence. He had to prove what he heard. He turned, shoving through the stunned crowd, his mind racing. Where? The alley. He had to go back to the sound. He had 1 hour to find proof of the other voice. He ran. Silas's development was not a choice. It was an explosion. It was revealed through action, not thought. He didn't decide to be a reluctant hero. He simply ran. The drunken persona, the shaking hands, the clouded eyes. It all burned away like a cheap fog in a hard wind. He was sober. He was focused. He was a man with 1 hour to dismantle a hanging. He burst through the stunned crowd, his movements no longer a stumble but a charge. He shoved past men who had bought him whiskey just yesterday, men who now spat at his feet. He's mad. The drunk's seen a ghost. Let the hanging go on. Their voices were a wave of scorn, but he didn't hear them. He heard only the internal monologue-style narration of his own memory. The thud, the man's voice, the scream. The clock was the sun, and it was moving. The crowd, sensing a dramatic turn, a break in the day's grim entertainment, followed. They were a jeering, curious mob, spilling out of the plaza and into the side streets, a river of judgment flowing behind him. And at the back of that crowd, standing apart, was Elias Thorne. He followed too. His face was a morally complex mask of stone, his eyes cold, watching. He did not mock. He observed. Silas ignored them all. He ran down the main street, turned into the narrow gap between the bank and the land office, and skidded to a halt in the alley. His alley, the scene of the crime. It was grounded in filth. The smell of spoiled grain, damp brick, and something metallic, like old blood. The pacing shifted from frantic race to slow burn investigation. He was on his hands and knees in an instant, his desperate focus absolute. He wasn't just searching. He was remembering. He crawled to the rain barrels, to the exact spot where he had huddled. The crowd gathered at the alley's mouth, their taunts quieting into tense, emotional whispers. They watched the town drunk scour the mud like a starving dog. Silas's fingers dug into the cold, wet earth, pushing aside rotting leaves and a broken bottle shard. Where was I? He closed his eyes, recalling the dark-to-light transition of the dawn, the way the first light hit the wall. He remembered scrambling, his hands slipping in the mud as he fled. He moved to that spot. His fingers brushed something hard, something small, something that wasn't a rock or glass. He pulled it free. The mud fell away, revealing a dull glint of metal. He held it in his palm, the cinematic weight of it silencing the world. It was a single, silver cufflink, ornate, heavy, etched with a crest he didn't recognize. It was half-trampled, but it was not a drunk's possession. It was not Sarah's. This was the clue the sheriff had missed. This was the shocking fact. He stood up slowly, the cufflink clutched in his fist. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked toward the judge's house, his mind connecting the open loop. The other voice. The argument. Inheritance. He knew, with chilling certainty, whose this was. While Silas's fist closed around the cold, evocative silver, the parallel storytelling cuts back, pulling our focus with an abrupt tonal shift to the gallows. Sarah had not moved. She remained a small, still point in the tense, swirling chaos of the day, an innocent child frozen at the epicenter of the town's rage. She was silent and terrified, but her terror was not the flailing, screaming kind. It was a deep, cold stillness, a resignation that was more heartbreaking than any plea. She watched the dust motes dance in the column of sunlight that struck the platform. She watched a hawk circle high above, free. Her world had shrunk to this platform, to the grounded feel of the rough-hewn planks beneath her bare feet, and to the cinematic visual metaphor that dominated her vision. The shadow of the noose. It was a dark-to-light transition in reverse, a line of darkness that crept slowly across her white dress as the sun arced toward the steeple. The wind was the only other character in her dramatic tableau. It was a poetic sigh, a whisper that traveled from the silent plains, through the stunned crowd, and up to her. It lifted a strand of her hair, making it dance. A cruel contrast of life against the instrument of death. The crowd was no longer jeering at Silas. His frantic departure had left a vacuum. Now, they were just waiting. Their grim silence was a confession. It was the sound of a town's collective moral dilemma, hardening into a terrible resolve. They had condemned her too quickly. They knew it. But to admit it now would be to admit their own fear, their own weakness, their own failure. And so, they watched the girl, their faces impassive, needing the emotional resolution of the rope to wash away their shame. This was the true violence. Not just the murder, but this calculated, silent consensus. We cut back. Silas is running. His hoofbeats are his own boots pounding the earth, a desperate rhythm against town's stillness. He holds the cufflink, a piece of silver that feels heavier than the entire town's judgment. He is a reluctant hero, propelled by a truth no one wants. Then, cut back to Sarah. She looks up, not at the crowd, but at the steeple. She is watching the shadow, the very line the sheriff drew. It is her clock. It is her executioner. The parallel storytelling braids these two fates. The man racing toward the shadow's deadline, and the child being overtaken by it. The contrast is absolute. Silas's desperate, emotional motion against Sarah's profound, heartfelt stillness. One man's frantic hope against a whole town's silent, violent failure. The pacing rhythmically accelerates toward climax. The slow-burn fuse lit by the sheriff's deadline has now reached the powder. Silas didn't just walk from the alley. He ran. He was a man possessed, not by drink, but by a dramatic, terrible purpose. The cufflink was a cold silver weight in his hand, a small key to a massive bloody lock. The crowd, sensing the emotional high stakes, followed him, their jeers turning to a tense, uncertain murmur. He wasn't heading back to the gallows. He was heading for the saloon. He shoved through the swinging doors so hard they slammed against the interior walls, the shocking sound silencing the low conversations inside. The air was thick with stale beer and fear. And there, sitting at his father's usual table in the back, shadowed, was Elias Thorne. He was nursing a whiskey, his hand steady, his suit jacket uncreased. He looked up, his eyes a morally complex shade of ice and impatience, as if Silas were just a stray dog that had wandered in. But Silas was not a dog. Not anymore. His development was complete. He was the relocutant hero, and his internal dilemma was over, replaced by a sincere, righteous focus. He strode directly to the table, the cinematic movement cutting a path through the gawking onlookers. He ignored the sheriff, who had followed him in, his face a mask of confusion. Silas's gaze was locked on Elias. He knew. Everyone in town knew, even if they never said it. Only one family in Crimson Ridge had a crest. Only one man wore silver cufflinks like this. The ones he'd inherited. The ones he wore with pride. Or perhaps arrogance. Silas stopped at the table. He was breathing hard. He was still dirty from the alley. He was the contrast to Elias's cold, clean power. He opened his hand. He didn't throw the cufflink. He placed it on the table. It landed with a soft, heavy click on the dark wood. A sound as loud as a gunshot in the dramatic pause that followed. "I was there," Silas said. His voice was not the gutter slur of the town drunk. It was minimalist, high impact. It was grounded. It cut through the room. Elias's eyes flickered to the cufflink, and for a fraction of a second his composure broke. It was a cut-on-reveal moment. The mask slipped. He knew what it was. He knew where it had been. Silas leaned in, his voice just for Elias. But in the silence, the whole room heard him. He didn't accuse. He didn't shout. He simply presented the moral dilemma. The truth. "You were there, Elias." He let the words hang. "You argued with your father." Another dramatic pause, forcing Elias, forcing the town, to live in the space between the words. The placing was now a rapid heartbeat. "I heard you." The emotional tone in the saloon shifted. It was no longer just curiosity. It was tense suspicion. The crowd looked from the silver cufflink to the pale, rigid face of Elias Thorne, to the ragged, inspirational figure of the town drunk who had just checkmated the king. The cliffhanger was total. Silas had said his piece. He had used his hour. The next move belonged to Elias. The saloon was a tomb. The climax of the mystery reveal had arrived, not with a gunshot, but with the soft click of silver on wood. Elias Thorne's emotionally complex facade, the cold, righteous anger that had condemned a child to death. It didn't just crack. It shattered. His eyes were fixed on the cufflink, the silver crest glinting under the firelight of the bar lanterns. He saw it, but he also saw the alley mud-caked in its crevices. He saw the truth. His internal dilemma was no longer a secret. It was on the table for everyone to see. He began to tremble. A slight tremor at first, in his perfectly manicured hands, then a visible, racking shudder. This reluctant hero, this drunk, had undone him. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his morally conflicted gaze shifting from Silas to Elias. The law was a heavy, cold thing in his gut, and it was finally pointing in the right direction. "Elias?" Brody's voice was grounded, stripped of all familiarity. It was the voice of the law, questioning its master. "What is he talking about?" Elias didn't answer. He was lost, his mind thrown back into the dark-to-light transition of the early morning. We see it as he sees it. The narrative structure, revealing the final truth. The argument. The foreshadowing from Silas's memory now paid off in full. It was about money. His inheritance. The judge, in his cinematic arrogance, had threatened to cut him off completely. "You are no son of mine." The words had been a blade. Elias, trapped, enraged, facing ruin. He hadn't meant to kill him. He had just needed him to listen, to see his side. He'd grabbed his father's arm. The judge shoved him back, hard. And Elias, development revealed through action. He'd snatched the heavy poker from the hearth. He hadn't swung it. He'd just lifted it. But the judge lunged. And Elias, in a dramatic flash of panic and rage, struck him, just once. The thud. The terrible, wet, final thud that Silas had heard. The judge fell. He didn't stumble. He collapsed, his head hitting the sharp corner of the oak desk. The emotional high stakes of the argument, resolved in one stupid, fatal second. Then, the silence. And in that silence, a gasp from the doorway. Sarah, the innocent child, her hand to her mouth, a tray of tea crashed at her feet. She had seen him. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped Elias. He was the judge's son. He was the town's future. He couldn't be a murderer. He looked at the girl, the orphan, the nobody, the perfect, easy target. He grabbed the poker from his own numb hand and thrust it into hers. He smeared the blood. He dragged her out. He sealed her fate to save his own. Back in the saloon, the dramatic pause stretched. The silence was deafening. Every person in that room was rewriting the day's history. They were all complicit. Elias Thorne looked up, his eyes empty, hollowed out by the devastating emotional resolution of his own truth. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at the gallows, visible through the window. The gallows he had built. He said it. The minimalist dialogue. The only two words that mattered. The confession. He wouldn't listen. The confession. He wouldn't listen. Fell into the silence and broke it. The emotional resolution was devastating. For a dramatic pause, the saloon held its breath. Then, the abrupt tonal shift began. It was not a shout. It was a groan. A low, tense sound that started at the back of the room and rippled outward. The crowd's fury, a singular, sharp-edged weapon aimed at an innocent child, now turned. It twisted, heavy and slow, toward the man in the dark suit. This was the moral frontier storytelling made real. The morally conflicted town, so quick to follow power, now turning on its own leader. Their rage at Elias was deeper, darker, because it was mixed with their own shame. He hadn't just murdered his father. He had made them complicit in the murder of a child. Sheriff Brody's face was grounded granite. His internal dilemma was gone, burned away by the shocking truth. He stepped past Silas. He did not hesitate. His hand did not go to his gun. It went to the iron cuffs on his belt. The click of the metal rings was the only sound. Elias Thorne. Brody's voice was minimalist, high impact. You are under arrest for the murder of Judge Thorne. Elias, broken, the emotionally complex antagonist finally empty, did not resist. He simply held out his wrists. The power in Crimson Ridge had just shifted, but Silas was already moving. His internal dilemma was resolved. He didn't watch the arrest. He didn't wait for thanks. His job wasn't finished. He turned and walked out of the saloon, back into the harsh, hopeful light. The Sunday, the cinematic visual metaphor that had been his enemy, was now just the Sunday. It had not yet touched the steeple. He had beaten the clock. He walked through the crowd, which parted for him now, their faces a mixture of awe and self-loathing. He walked to the gallows. He walked up the wooden steps, each one a heavy, final sound. Sarah was still there, a small, poetic statue of fear. She was, watching him, her eyes wide, not daring to believe. He stood in front of her. He, the town drunk, the reluctant hero. He looked at the thick, braided rope, the instrument of their collective sin. His hands, the same hands that had fumbled with bottles, the same hands that had dug in the mud. They were shaking again. But this time, it wasn't from need. It was from sincere purpose. This was the dark-to-light transition made flesh. The town's lowest man performing its highest act of grace. With shaking hands, he reached up. He fumbled with the hangman's knot. It was tight, emotionally descriptive. Language could not capture the feel of that tense, oiled hemp. He pulled. He worked the loop, his breath catching. And then, it was loose. He pulled the noose. The noose. From her neck. It fell to the platform with a soft, heavy thud. The sound of the murder. Now the sound of her release. He untied her bound wrists. The rope fell away. She was free. Sarah didn't cry. She hadn't cried when they condemned her, and she didn't cry now. She just breathed. A single, shuddering, heartfelt breath that was the first free air she'd tasted all day. She watched Silas, this broken, reluctant hero, his shaking hands now resting at his sides. Her emotionally descriptive gaze was not just gratitude. It was the emotional complexity of someone who had looked into the void and been pulled back by the most unexpected hand. Silas, however, did not meet her gaze for long. His internal dilemma was resolved. He saw Sheriff Brody leading Elias away in cuffs, a cinematic shot of a new, harder justice. But the emotional resolution brought him no uplifting joy. He looked out at the crowd. Their faces were his true burden. They were not hopeful. They were ashamed. The moral frontier storytelling was complete. The townspeople looked at their own hands, hands that had, hours ago, been raised in agreement to kill. They looked at the empty noose, now a symbol of their own failure. They looked at Silas, and he could not bear their gaze. It was too heavy. The town's failure was a tangible thing, a bittersweet dust settling over the entire plaza. His internal dilemma was over, but the man he was remained. He didn't belong on this platform. He didn't belong in the dark-to-light transition he had just forced upon them. He was a creature of the alleys, of the grounded shadows. He nodded once, a minimalist, high-impact gesture, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to the steeple, to the son he had beaten. He turned his back on the girl, on the crowd, on the entire moral frontier climax. He walked down the gallows steps. He found his hat, which had fallen in the dust. He slapped the dirt from it and placed it on his head, pulling the brim low. A shield, a return. He fades back into the streets. The tense crowd parted for him, a silent sea of regret. No one spoke. No one thanked him. And he expected nothing. His inspirational action was not for them. It was for the contrast between innocence and violence, a debt he paid to the memory of a thud. Sarah is safe. That is the hopeful note, the rising sun in the midst of the town's moral midnight. But the town itself, Crimson Ridge, is left with its conscience. They have to live with the fact that they gathered to watch an innocent child die. They have to live with the knowledge that their savior was the man they despised most. The emotional tone is bittersweet, an understanding that this moment doesn't wash away the sin. It just highlights it. The narration style pulls back. We watch Silas disappear into the same alley he crawled out of. The camera, the mind's eye, turns from him. It turns to us. The direct-to-viewer address begins, simple, but emotionally rich. We are left with the final open loop. Not a mystery, but a question. What separates justice from murder? The rhetorical question hangs in the dramatic pause. Is it the law? Is it the judgment of a crowd? Or is it the truth? The evocative narration forces the final moral dilemma onto the audience. Sometimes, just one man who remembers what he heard.